Welcome to West Film. We bring you the best movie recaps, reviews, ending explained videos, and hidden details from your favorite films. If you love great movies, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now grab some popcorn, and let's jump into today's movie. The experience Arnold Schwarzenegger gained playing Conan helped him sharpen his ability to communicate through physical performance, facial expression, and subtle humor, skills that would later prove essential in films like Predator, Total Recall, and True Lies. Some critics feel the sequel softened Conan's personality compared to the first film, but Schwarzenegger still delivered a more approachable hero while holding on to the intimidating presence audiences expected of him. Sarah Douglas played the ambitious Queen Taramis, and she was already well known among science fiction and fantasy fans by the time the film came out. British audiences had first recognized her through television before she found worldwide fame playing the Kryptonian villain Ursa in Superman and Superman 2. Her knack for playing cold, intelligent, manipulative antagonists made her a natural fit for Queen Taramis. Douglas brought elegance and authority to the role, balancing royal sophistication with a sense of underlying menace. Her screen time is fairly limited, but she still manages to establish the dangerous political atmosphere that drives the story forward. Throughout the 1980s she kept appearing in genre films and at conventions, becoming one of the most recognizable faces in fantasy and science fiction cinema. Olivia D'Abo played Princess Jenna, whose innocence sits at the heart of the quest. Conan the Destroyer was one of her earliest major film roles as she was still in her teens during production, yet she carried a significant emotional weight throughout the story. Jenna starts out as a sheltered royal figure but gradually grows more confident as she faces extraordinary dangers. Dabo's performance introduced audiences to a young actress who would go on to enjoy a long career in television, voice acting, and film, eventually becoming well known for roles in shows like The Wonder Years and numerous animated productions, a proof of real versatility beyond fantasy adventure. Will Chamberlain appeared as Bombata, Jenna's loyal guardian, bringing an entirely different kind of celebrity to the production. Before acting, Chamberlain had already achieved legendary status as one of basketball's greatest players, and standing well over 7 feet tall, his sheer physical presence suited the fantasy genre perfectly. Unlike many athletes who try their hand at acting, Chamberlain brought surprising restraint to the role. Bombata serves as both protector and eventual antagonist, which forced Chamberlain to balance loyalty, intimidation, and inner conflict. His duel with Conan remains one of the film's most memorable action sequences, simply because it pits two physically imposing icons against one another. Chamberlain appeared in relatively few films, but Conan the Destroyer remains his best-known dramatic performance. Grace Jones played the fierce warrior Zula, one of the film's most unforgettable characters. Already internationally famous as a singer, fashion icon, and model, Jones had a striking presence unlike anyone else in Hollywood at the time. Her distinctive style, commanding confidence, and athletic build made her perfectly suited to the fantasy setting. Zula quickly became a fan favorite thanks to her fearless combat skills, dry humor, and unshakable courage. Jones needed very little dialogue, because her physical performance alone communicated determination and strength. Her presence also pushed back against the traditional expectations placed on female action characters in the early 1980s. Rather than serving as a romantic interest or a damsel in distress, Zula fights alongside Conan as an equal. The role broadened Jones's film career and remains one of her most celebrated screen performances, alongside her later appearances in A View to a Kill and Vamp. Tracy Walter played Malak, the comic relief of the adventure. By the time he joined the production, Walter had already built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most dependable character actors. His expressive face, nervous energy, and impeccable comic timing let him create memorable supporting characters across a range of genres. Malak provides levity throughout the journey, his cowardice and greed and occasional unexpected bravery are contrasting nicely with Conan's seriousness. Walter went on to build an impressive career in films including Repo Man, Batman, and City Slickers, among many others, becoming one of those instantly recognizable actors whose presence consistently lifts an ensemble cast. Mako returned as the Wizard hero, reprising his role from Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Destroyer occupies an interesting place in the history of fantasy cinema, arriving as it did during a period when Hollywood was discovering just how much of an appetite audiences had for sword and sorcery adventure. Released in 1984, the film was part of a wave of fantasy productions trying to capitalize on the popularity of Conan the Barbarian, Star Wars, and other epic adventures that had already proven audiences were willing to embrace imaginary worlds on a grand scale. The sequel wasn't received with the same enthusiasm as its predecessor, but its influence reached well beyond its initial box office performance. Over the decades it has become an important cultural artifact reflecting both the ambitions and the limitations of 1980s fantasy filmmaking. The original Conan the Barbarian had introduced mainstream audiences to Robert E. Howard's legendary warrior through a brutal, violent, and mature take that emphasized revenge, survival, and personal destiny. Conan the Destroyer deliberately shifted toward a broader audience, dialing back the graphic violence and adding more humor, colorful supporting characters, magical creatures, and traditional adventure elements. Longtime fans criticized this tonal change, but it reflected a larger trend within Hollywood at the time. Studios increasingly wanted family-friendly fantasy spectacles that could appeal to teenagers as well as adults, a style that would go on to shape numerous fantasy adventures released throughout the rest of the 1980s. The film also reinforced the growing popularity of muscular heroes who dominated action cinema during the decade. Schwarzenegger's Conan represented an idealized warrior whose strength, determination, and physical endurance became defining traits for many of the action protagonists who followed. Throughout the 1980s, audiences embraced heroes who overcame impossible odds through courage and overwhelming physical power rather than complex psychological conflict. Alongside performers like Sylvester Stallone, Dolph Lundgren, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and Chuck Norris, Schwarzenegger helped define an era in which larger-than-life heroes became symbols of determination and resilience. Conan the Destroyer contributed meaningfully to shaping that image before Schwarzenegger fully transitioned into science fiction and modern action films. One of the movie's most significant cultural contributions was its visual take on fantasy worlds. Before computer-generated imagery became widespread, filmmakers relied on practical sets, elaborate costumes, prosthetic creatures, miniatures, and detailed production design to build believable fictional environments. Conan the Destroyer showcased massive temples, ancient ruins, mystical castles, enchanted forests, and giant monsters, nearly all of it built through traditional filmmaking techniques. For younger viewers growing up in the 1980s, these handcrafted worlds felt like pure cinematic magic, and even today many fantasy fans appreciate the tangible quality of these practical effects, which still hold a charm that modern digital environments often lack. The movie also reflected changing attitudes toward female characters in fantasy adventure. Many earlier sword and sorcery stories portrayed women mainly as victims or romantic interests, but Conan the Destroyer introduced Zula, played by Grace Jones, who defied a lot of those genre expectations. Zulu is physically powerful, highly skilled in combat, fiercely independent, and fights alongside Conan as an equal rather than depending on him for protection. Jones herself already represented unconventional beauty standards and a strong sense of artistic individuality, which made her casting especially significant. Her performance inspired admiration among audiences who appreciated seeing a female warrior portrayed with genuine strength rather than existing purely as decoration. Likewise, casting Wilt Chamberlain as Bombata showed Hollywood's willingness to bring major athletes into fantasy filmmaking. Chamberlain's extraordinary height suited mythical storytelling naturally, reinforcing the larger-than-life atmosphere the genre called for. The film was part of a broader trend in which professional athletes, bodybuilders, and wrestlers increasingly turned up in fantasy and action cinema, forging a connection between physical excellence and heroic storytelling that stayed popular throughout the decade. Another important part of the film's cultural significance lies in its contribution to tabletop role-playing and fantasy gaming culture. In the early 1980s, games inspired by heroic fantasy were becoming increasingly popular around the world, and Conan the Destroyer featured nearly every classic fantasy archetype audiences associated with role-playing adventures: the mighty barbarian, the wise wizard, the fearless female warrior, the greedy thief, the mysterious princess, enchanted castles, magical artifacts, deadly monsters, and epic quests. For many viewers, the film played out like a fantasy campaign brought vividly to life, and that structure went on to shape how countless players imagined adventures in tabletop games and, later, fantasy video games. The movie also helped keep fantasy literature popular beyond the cinema. Robert E. Howard's Conan's stories saw renewed interest following the success of both films, and new generations of readers discovered the original pulp adventures, and publishers released fresh editions of Howard's work alongside novels from other fantasy authors. Conan's popularity encouraged a greater appreciation for sword and sorcery fiction, contributing to the wider acceptance of fantasy as a commercially successful genre rather than merely a niche interest. As home video expanded during the mid to late 1980s, Conan the Destroyer found an entirely new audience. Many viewers first experienced the film on VHS rather than in theaters. Video stores had become an essential part of popular culture, and the striking cover art of Arnold Schwarzenegger wielding a sword made the movie impossible to miss on store shelves. Countless children and teenagers discovered the film during weekend rentals, letting it become a nostalgic favorite despite its mixed critical reception. Its second life on home video arguably ended up mattering more than its original theatrical run. Behind the scenes, Conan the Destroyer tells a story almost as fascinating as the adventure on screen. The production was one of the most ambitious fantasy projects of the early 1980s, bringing together enormous sets, international filming locations, elaborate practical effects, and an eclectic group of performers whose backgrounds ranged from bodybuilding and professional sports to music and classical acting. The finished film adopted a lighter tone than its predecessor, but making it still required significant logistical planning and creative problem-solving. Every sword fight, monster encounter, and magical temple demanded careful coordination long before modern digital technology could simplify that kind of work. The sequel entered development shortly after Conan the Barbarian's commercial success. The first film had gotten mixed reviews, but it performed well enough financially to convince Universal Pictures that audiences wanted more adventures with the Cimmerian warrior. At the same time, Schwarzenegger's popularity was rising fast, and studio executives recognized that another Conan film could capitalize on his growing fame while also expanding the franchise into something more accessible for younger audiences. One of the biggest creative decisions was replacing director John Milius with Richard Fleischer. Milius had directed Conan the Barbarian in a serious, almost mythological style inspired by historical epics and samurai cinema. His version emphasized brutality, philosophy, and survival, creating a dark atmosphere aimed mainly at adult audiences. For the sequel, Universal wanted a broader adventure with more humor, more colorful characters, and less graphic violence. Fleischer, an experienced filmmaker known for directing large-scale productions across multiple genres, was chosen for his ability to balance action with mainstream entertainment. He approached the material differently, placing more emphasis on teamwork, magical creatures, and classic adventure storytelling rather than the grim realism that defined the original film. The screenplay went through numerous revisions before filming began. Early drafts reportedly leaned darker, closer to the tone of Conan the Barbarian, but studio executives pushed for changes that would secure a lower age rating. Violence was reduced, the dialogue got lighter, and several comedic moments were added for the supporting cast, particularly Malik. These decisions divided fans for decades. Some appreciated the more entertaining, family-friendly approach, while others felt the sequel abandoned the harsher world established in the first movie. Either way, the behind-the-scenes discussions showed just how strongly commercial considerations can shape the direction of a film. Most of the production took place in Mexico, where the filmmakers found landscapes capable of standing in for the mythical Hyborian Age. Vast deserts, rocky mountains, ancient-looking ruins, forests, and remote valleys provided spectacular natural scenery without requiring expensive artificial environments. The Mexican locations gave the film a sense of scale that would have been difficult to recreate on studio backlots alone. Many outdoor sequences benefited from real sunlight and dramatic terrain, letting cinematographer Jack Cardiff capture wide panoramic shots that emphasize the dangerous world Conan inhabits. Large interior sets were built to portray Queen Taramisa's palace, mystical temples, underground chambers, and sacred sanctuaries are filled with enormous statues, towering columns, elaborate staircases, giant doors, and intricate carvings inspired by ancient civilizations. Rather than relying solely on painted backdrops, the production built substantial physical environments that actors could genuinely interact with. This practical approach enhanced the performances, since the actors were surrounded by tangible architecture instead of having to imagine digital scenery that would be added later. Costume preparation was another enormous undertaking. Every major character needed distinctive armor, robes, jewelry, weapons, boots, belts, and accessories reflecting their personality and social status. Conan's wardrobe evolves slightly from the previous film, keeping his rugged barbarian look while adding more refined details fitting for a seasoned hero. Grace Jones's costume designers created striking leather armor that complemented her athletic build while reinforcing Zula's image as an unstoppable warrior. Sarah Douglas's royal costumes emphasized elegance and authority, while Olivia d'Abo's princess wardrobe gradually changed to reflect her character's journey from sheltered royalty toward greater independence. One of the production's greatest strengths was its commitment to practical special effects. Computer-generated imagery remained extremely limited in the early 1980s, so nearly every magical creature had to be physically built. The giant horned monster Dagoth represented one of the production's most ambitious achievements. Professional wrestling legend Andre Tilda copyrights the giant performed inside an elaborate costume covered with heavy prosthetics, mechanical facial components, and layers of makeup. The suit required hours of preparation each day and significantly restricted his movement. But Andre Tilda copyright's enormous natural size combined with the creature design to produce an imposing screen presence that still holds up decades later. The memorable battle against the Crystal Palace Guardian also showed off the ingenuity of the special effects department. The creature combined puppetry, mechanical engineering, optical effects, and carefully choreographed camera work to create the illusion of a living magical being. Just a few seconds of convincing movement often took days of preparation, multiple operators, and repeated takes. Today, these sequences have a handcrafted quality that many audiences still appreciate, precisely because every effect existed physically in front of the camera. Schwarzenegger approached the sequel with considerably more confidence than he'd shown in the first film, having already completed Conan the Barbarian and a few other acting projects. He felt increasingly comfortable with complex fight choreography and delivering dialogue. The story of Conan the Destroyer follows a classic heroic quest structure, but beneath its straightforward adventure lies a carefully built narrative combining mythology, fantasy spectacle, and character-driven moments. Unlike Conan the Barbarian, which focused heavily on revenge and personal destiny, the sequel takes the shape of a traditional quest. Conan is no longer driven solely by vengeance or survival. Instead, he becomes the leader of a group brought together to accomplish what looks like a noble mission. As the story unfolds, though, the audience discovers the quest is built on deception, forcing Conan to choose between personal desire and moral responsibility. This shift gives the sequel a lighter tone while still holding on to many of the heroic themes associated with classic fantasy literature. The film opens shortly after the events of the first movie. Conan is still wandering the ancient world, carrying the emotional weight of losing Valeria, the woman he loved. He's become a legendary warrior feared across the land, but he remains haunted by grief and solitude. This opening immediately reminds viewers that beneath Conan's extraordinary strength lies a man driven by deeply personal emotion. His reputation has grown, but emotionally he's still searching for meaning beyond endless battles. The story truly begins when Queen Taramis summons Conan to her palace. She offers him an irresistible bargain. If he agrees to escort her young niece, Princess Jenna, on a dangerous quest, she'll use her magical powers to resurrect Valeria. For Conan, this represents the chance to recover the only person he ever truly loved. It's a clever narrative device, because it immediately gives the hero a deeply emotional motivation while also planting the seeds of future conflict. The audience understands that Conan's judgment may be clouded by hope, leaving him vulnerable to manipulation. Queen Taramis explains that Jenna carries the royal blood needed to retrieve an ancient magical artifact hidden inside a heavily protected fortress. Once recovered, that artifact will grant access to an even greater treasure inside an ancient temple. The quest looks straightforward on the surface, but viewers quickly sense that the Queen's true intentions remain hidden, and that mystery builds suspense without giving away the central betrayal too early. Conan soon assembles a diverse group of companions, each filling a familiar fantasy archetype. Akiro the Wizard returns as the wise advisor whose magical knowledge proves invaluable throughout the journey. Malak provides comic relief through his greed, nervousness, and occasional bursts of unexpected courage. Zula joins the party after Conan saves her from execution, immediately proving her loyalty through fierce combat skill and unwavering determination. And Bombata serves as Princess Jenna's official guardian, appearing honorable while secretly carrying out Queen Taramis's hidden orders. The journey follows many of the beats found in classic adventure storytelling. The heroes travel through dangerous landscapes, encounter magical creatures, overcome physical obstacles, and gradually deepen their bonds through shared hardship. Each stop along the way introduces a new challenge that tests a different aspect of the group's abilities. Rather than leaning on constant combat, the film balances action with puzzles, supernatural encounters, moments of humor, and chances for the characters to interact. One of the earliest major turning points comes when the group reaches the mysterious Crystal Castle, where they face an unusual guardian unlike anything Conan has fought before. Not a traditional warrior or monstrous beast, but a magical creature that blends illusion with deadly physical attacks. This sequence serves a couple of purposes. It shows that the quest involves supernatural dangers beyond Conan's usual experience, and it lets every member of the team contribute to the victory, reinforcing the idea that even the greatest warrior can't succeed entirely alone. After this victory, the party retrieves a magical jeweled horn, apparently completing the first stage of their mission. But the audience starts noticing increasingly suspicious behavior from Bombatu and in Queen Tarames's instructions. These small moments of secrecy gradually build tension without immediately revealing the coming betrayal, letting viewers suspect hidden motives while staying uncertain exactly how things will unfold. As the journey continues, the relationships among the characters become just as important as the individual action scenes. Conan gradually develops genuine concern for Princess Jenna, even though he initially viewed her only as a means to recovering Valeria. Zulu earns Conan's respect through repeated displays of courage and loyalty. Malak, despite his selfish streak, slowly turns into a dependable companion willing to risk his own safety for the group. Even Bombata seems torn between his loyalty to Queen Taramis and the growing respect he develops for Conan during their travels. The narrative hits its central turning point when the group finally reaches the ancient temple where the true purpose of the quest is revealed. Queen Taramis never intended to resurrect Valeria. Instead, Princess Jenna has been brought to the temple as a human sacrifice needed to awaken Dagoth, an immensely powerful horned god capable of granting vast supernatural power. This revelation completely changes the audience's understanding of everything that's happened so far. What looked like a noble expedition was actually an elaborate deception designed to manipulate Conan into delivering the princess to her death. The betrayal forces Conan into the most important moral decision of the film. Throughout the story his actions have been driven mainly by the hope of seeing Valeria again. Now he has to choose between his deepest desire and the life of an innocent young woman who has come to trust him completely. Although Conan the Destroyer is remembered mainly as a fantasy adventure full of sword fights, monsters, and magical quests, the film carries a surprising amount of thematic depth beneath its colorful surface. Unlike its predecessor, which explored darker ideas around revenge, civilization, and survival, this sequel leans more into heroism, temptation, loyalty, sacrifice, and the corrupting influence of power. Nearly every major event in the story reflects one of these central themes. And even if audiences simply enjoy the movie as entertainment, these deeper ideas quietly shape every decision the characters make. Perhaps the strongest theme running through the film is the struggle between selfish desire and selfless duty. At the start of the story, Conan accepts Queen Taramis's mission for entirely personal reasons and not wealth, glory, or the protection of innocent people, but the belief that completing the quest will bring Valeria back from the dead. This emotional longing drives every step of his journey. He's willing to risk his life because he can't let go of the woman he loved. As the adventure unfolds, though, Conan gradually shifts his priorities. Spending time with Princess Jenna and the rest of his companions reminds him that protecting the living matters more than desperately trying to reclaim the past. When Queen Taramis finally reveals that Jenna must die to complete the ritual, Conan faces the film's defining choice: pursue his own happiness by letting the sacrifice happen, or reject the Queen's promise and save an innocent life. His decision transforms him from a warrior chasing personal fulfillment into a true hero willing to give up his deepest desire for someone else's future. A reminder that genuine heroism often means giving up something precious for the sake of others. Another major theme is the corrupting nature of power. Nearly every antagonist in the film seeks supernatural power rather than wisdom or justice. Queen Taramis manipulates everyone around her because she believes absolute magical authority justifies deception and murder, and the ancient ritual exists solely to awaken Dagoth, a godlike being whose destructive potential promises unimaginable control over the kingdom. Rather than earning leadership through honor or compassion, the villain tries to seize dominance through forbidden magic and human sacrifice. This contrast highlights one of the film's central moral lessons: power pursued without responsibility inevitably leads to destruction. Queen Taramis believes she can control forces beyond human understanding, yet the very creature she seeks to command ultimately becomes uncontrollably. Dagoth destroys friend and foe alike, proving that absolute power rarely stays loyal to those who summon it. The film suggests that the desire to dominate others eventually destroys the person seeking that dominance. Closely tied to this is a recurring theme of temptation. Every major character faces some form of it during the story. Conan is tempted by the possibility of resurrecting Valeria. Malak constantly struggles with greed and the lure of treasure. Bombata wrestles with conflicting loyalties between his duty to Queen Taramis and his growing respect for Conan, and even Princess Jenna faces temptation through her curiosity about the magical destiny surrounding her. Unlike many fantasy stories where temptation shows up as obvious evil, Conan the Destroyer presents it as something far more emotionally complicated. Conan's desire is understandable precisely because it grows out of love rather than selfish ambition. That makes his eventual rejection of Queen Taramis's bargain far more meaningful. He chooses morality not because it's easy, but because he comes to understand that true love can't be built on the suffering of innocent people. Friendship and loyalty also grow more important as the story progresses. Conan begins the film as a solitary wanderer used to surviving through his own strength, but the quest gradually teaches him the value of companionship. Each member of the group contributes something no single hero could replace. Hero brings wisdom and magical knowledge. Zula brings courage and exceptional combat skill. Malak applies resourcefulness despite his cowardly tendencies, and even Bombata's presence creates the dramatic tension that forces Conan to question trust itself. This emphasis on teamwork sets the sequel apart from many action films of its era, where a single hero typically solves every problem alone. Conan remains the central figure, but victory here depends on cooperation, suggesting that strength lies not just in physical power but in a willingness to rely on others when times are hard. The film also explores destiny versus free will. Ancient prophecies, magical rituals, and royal bloodlines all suggest certain events are predetermined. A Princess Jenna appears destined to fulfill the ritual because of her ancestry, and Conan seems destined to complete the Queen's mission because of his unmatched abilities. Yet every crucial moment in the story shows that individuals retain the power to choose their own paths. Conan ultimately rejects the destiny Queen Taramis prepared for him. Princess Jenna refuses to accept becoming a passive sacrifice. Even Bombata struggles against the role the Queen assigned him. These choices reinforce the idea that while fate may create opportunities, personal choice determines true character. People define themselves through their actions, not through prophecy alone. The film's symbolism reinforces these larger themes throughout. Conan's sword is the most obvious symbol. More than just a weapon, it represents justice, responsibility, and earned strength. Conan never uses it to dominate innocent people or grab political power. He draws it only in self-defense or when confronting genuine evil. Unlike Queen Taramis's magical rituals, Conan's sword symbolizes honest effort rather than a shortcut to power. The magical jeweled horn works as another important symbol. On the surface it's just an ancient artifact needed to complete the quest, but symbolically it represents forbidden knowledge and humanity's dangerous fascination with unlocking powers better left untouched. One of the defining qualities of Conan the Destroyer is its rich visual presentation. The film doesn't have the darker, more grounded aesthetic of Conan the Barbarian, but it makes up for that with a broader fantasy style built on colorful locations, elaborate costumes, towering sets, practical creature effects, and grand cinematic compositions. Released at a time when computer-generated imagery was still in its infancy, nearly every visual element on screen was physically built, painted, sculpted, or filmed on location. The result is a fantasy world that feels tangible and handcrafted, giving the film a timeless quality that continues to appeal to viewers who appreciate practical filmmaking. The visual identity of Conan the Destroyer immediately sets it apart from its predecessor. Conan the Barbarian often relied on muted earth tones, harsh landscapes, and naturalistic lighting to create an atmosphere of brutal realism. Conan the Destroyer, by comparison, adopts a brighter palette full of vivid colors, majestic architecture, mystical temples, shimmering crystals, lush forests, and ornate palaces. This stylistic shift reflects the film's lighter tone and more traditional fairy tale structure rather than presenting Hyboru as a harsh, unforgiving world. The sequel turns it into a land of magical adventure where every new location promises another extraordinary discovery. The cinematography was handled by the legendary Jack Cardiff, whose career already stretched back decades by the time production began. Cardiff was widely respected for his understanding of color, composition, and visual storytelling, and he brought enormous experience to the project, carefully balancing epic landscapes with intimate character moments. His ability to photograph both natural environments and elaborate studio sets gave the film a consistent visual identity despite its wide range of locations. One of Cardiff's greatest strengths was his use of wide panoramic shots. Throughout the movie, the camera frequently pulls back to reveal enormous mountains, deserts, valleys, forests, and castles stretching toward the horizon. These sweeping images constantly remind viewers of the sheer scale of Conan's world rather than feeling confined to a handful of locations. The journey feels like it spans an entire continent full of ancient civilizations and forgotten kingdoms. The vast landscapes reinforce Conan's identity as a wandering adventurer whose story unfolds in a world much bigger than himself. The framing of individual characters also contributes a great deal to the storytelling. Schwarzenegger is consistently shot from slightly low camera angles, making Conan appear even more physically dominant. These compositions exaggerate his height, muscular build, and heroic presence without needing dialogue to establish his strength. Whenever Conan enters battle, the camera often positions him at the center of the frame, emphasizing that he's the emotional and physical anchor of the story. Queen Taramis, by contrast, is often framed within symmetrical architectural spaces surrounded by towering columns, ornate thrones, and carefully arranged decor. These balanced compositions communicate control, authority, and political power even before the audience fully understands her true intentions. The visual language subtly suggests she's carefully manipulating everything around her from the safety of her palace. Grace Jones's Zula gets similarly distinctive visual treatment. Rather than presenting her as secondary to Conan, the cinematography often places both warriors side by side within the same frame, emphasizing equality rather than hierarchy. During combat sequences, quick camera movements follow her athletic attacks, letting audiences appreciate both her speed and her confidence. Her striking silhouette, distinctive hairstyle, and powerful posture make her instantly recognizable in nearly every scene. Lighting plays an equally important role throughout the film. Daytime sequences make extensive use of natural sunlight, creating bright, high-contrast images that highlight the rugged terrain and colorful costumes. Exterior scenes have an almost mythological clarity, letting audiences fully appreciate the craftsmanship behind the production design. The sunlit landscapes also reinforce the adventurous tone, presenting Hyboria as an exciting world waiting to be explored rather than a place consumed entirely by darkness. Night scenes bring in a completely different visual atmosphere. Torches, campfires, candles, and magical flames become the primary light sources, casting flickering shadows across ancient stone walls and weathered faces. This practical lighting adds depth while enhancing the mystical qualities of the environment, and the contrast between warm firelight and deep surrounding darkness gives the nighttime sequences a sense of mystery without ever feeling visually confusing. The production design deserves particular recognition for creating one of the most memorable fantasy worlds of the decade. Every major location has its own architectural identity. Queen Taramis's palace combines regal elegance with imposing scale, featuring enormous staircases, polished stone surfaces, massive columns, and elaborate decorative detail of the environment immediately communicates wealth and authority while hinting at the corruption hidden beneath its beautiful appearance. The Crystal Castle is one of the film's most visually imaginative settings, with transparent surfaces, reflective materials, unusual geometric shapes, and shimmering textures creating an environment unlike anything else in the story. The location feels magical without relying on digital effects, showing off the creativity of production designers who pulled off these illusions through practical construction and carefully controlled lighting. The soundtrack and sound design of Conan the Destroyer play a crucial role in shaping the film's identity. Audiences often remember the movie for its action sequences, colorful fantasy settings, and larger-than-life characters. But much of its emotional impact comes from what they hear rather than what they see. The music guides the audience through moments of triumph, mystery, danger, humor, and tragedy, while the carefully crafted sound effects make the mythical world of Hyboria feel alive. In an era before digital sound technology became commonplace, every sword clash, monster roar, echoing temple, and orchestral cue had to be created with meticulous craftsmanship. Together, the score and sound design turn a straightforward adventure into an immersive fantasy experience. Conan the Barbarian's legendary score by Basil Poledouris became one of the most celebrated film soundtracks ever composed, and Poledouris returned to score Conan the Destroyer as well, ensuring musical continuity between the two films. Rather than abandoning the themes audiences already associated with Conan, Poledouris expanded his musical language to reflect the sequel's lighter, more adventurous tone. His compositions preserve the heroic grandeur established in the first film while introducing melodies that emphasize exploration, companionship, magic, and wonder. One of the greatest strengths of Poledouris's work is his sense of orchestral storytelling. Rather than treating the music as simple background accompaniment, he uses the orchestra almost like another character in the narrative. Brass instruments frequently represent Conan's courage and physical strength, while strings provide emotional depth during quieter scenes. Woodwinds introduce moments of mystery or innocence, particularly in scenes involving Princess Jenna, while percussion drives the action during battles, chases, and confrontations with monstrous creatures. From the film's opening moments, the audience immediately recognizes familiar musical themes tied to Conan himself. These recurring motifs act almost like musical signatures whenever Conan prepares for battle or faces overwhelming danger, reminding viewers of his legendary reputation through bold, triumphant orchestration. This use of leitmotif lets the audience connect emotionally with the character even during scenes with relatively little dialogue. Here the music tells us who Conan is before he speaks a single word. Poledouris also adapts these heroic themes depending on the emotional context. During quieter moments, Conan's musical motif often slows down and turns more reflective, acknowledging the sadness that still lingers after the loss of Valeria. These softer arrangements remind audiences that beneath the fearless warrior is a man carrying emotional wounds that have never fully healed. The score serves not just the action, but Conan's internal journey too. The quest itself gets its own musical identity. As the group travels across deserts, forests, mountains, and ancient ruins, the score shifts toward adventurous melodies that capture the excitement of exploration. Rather than overwhelming the visuals, these compositions build a sense of momentum, encouraging viewers to feel that every new destination promises another extraordinary discovery, turning long travel sequences into epic journeys worthy of mythological storytelling. Princess Jenna's scenes come with gentle orchestration that emphasizes innocence, vulnerability, and royal heritage. Her delicate strings and softer harmonies set her apart from the harsher musical textures surrounding Conan or Queen Taramis. As Jenna matures throughout the adventure, her musical presence gradually grows more confident, subtly reflecting her emotional development. Audiences may not consciously notice these changes, but they contribute significantly to how they perceive her growth. Queen Taramis gets darker musical material built around slower tempos, lower brass, and ominous harmonies. Rather than portraying her as openly monstrous from the start, the music creates an atmosphere of restrained menace even when she appears calm and composed. Subtle musical cues hint at hidden intentions beneath her royal elegance. This understated approach lets suspense build naturally without giving away her deception too soon. One of the score's most effective qualities is its use of silence. Poldris understood that constant music can actually reduce dramatic impact during moments of uncertainty or suspense, so the orchestra often fades away almost completely, letting natural environmental sounds take over. The absence of music heightens tension because audiences instinctively sense that something dangerous may be about to happen, and when the orchestra finally returns, its emotional impact lands that much harder. The action sequences show off Poldris's remarkable ability to sync music with movement rather than simply cranking up the volume during battles. The score closely follows the rhythm of the choreography. Sword strikes, charging warriors, collapsing structures, and dramatic reveals frequently line up with orchestral accents, creating a seamless relationship between sound and image. This synchronization gives the action greater energy while helping keep audiences emotionally engaged through extended combat scenes. The climactic battle inside the temple features some of the score's most dramatic material. As Dagoth awakens, the orchestra expands into powerful, aggressive compositions dominated by brass fanfares, pounding percussion, and intense choral textures. The music communicates that the heroes are up against something far beyond an ordinary enemy. Dagoth isn't presented as just another monster, but as an ancient supernatural force capable of reshaping the world itself, and the score amplifies the creature's terrifying presence long before it physically attacks. Beyond the orchestral music, the sound design adds enormously to the film's immersive atmosphere. Every environment has its own distinctive audio identity. Forests echo with bird song, insects, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls, while desert landscapes emphasize wind sweeping across empty terrain. When Conan the Destroyer premiered in the summer of 1984, expectations were unusually high. The original Conan the Barbarian had established Schwarzenegger as a legitimate leading man and had become a commercial success despite a mixed critical response. In the 2 years between the films, Schwarzenegger's popularity had grown rapidly and excitement around fantasy adventure remained strong. Many moviegoers expected the sequel to build on everything that had made the first film memorable. Instead, Conan the Destroyer received one of the more divided receptions of any major fantasy film of the decade. Critics and longtime fans often disagreed with the creative direction, while many casual audiences simply embraced it as an entertaining adventure. Over time the film has developed a much warmer reputation, showing how public opinion can shift across generations. One of the most common criticisms centered on the dramatic change in tone. Viewers who admired Conan the Barbarian praised its serious atmosphere, philosophical themes, brutal violence, and mythological storytelling. The sequel intentionally moved in a different direction, emphasizing humor, teamwork, magical creatures, colorful settings, and a broader sense of adventure. For many critics, this shift made the world of Conan feel less dangerous and less emotionally powerful. They argued that the darker atmosphere of the original had been replaced by a more conventional fantasy adventure aimed at younger audiences. Several reviewers also commented on the reduced level of violence. Conan the Barbarian had earned a reputation for combat that carried genuine weight and consequence. Battles felt brutal, injuries looked painful, and every victory came at a cost. Conan the Destroyer softened those elements considerably to secure a more family-friendly rating. Sword fights remained plentiful, but the action generally became less graphic and more stylized, and some critics felt this weakened the sense of realism that had set the first film apart from other early 1980s fantasy productions. The screenplay generated another frequent point of discussion. Reviewers often described the story as simpler and more predictable than its predecessor. Rather than focusing on Conan's deeply personal journey of revenge, the sequel adopted a traditional quest narrative involving magical artifacts, ancient prophecies, and an evil queen manipulating events from behind the scenes. Many critics acknowledged the plot worked well as straightforward entertainment, but felt it lacked the emotional complexity and philosophical ambition that had made the original stand out within the fantasy genre. Schwarzenegger's performance, though, drew considerably more positive attention than most other aspects of the film. By 1984 he'd become a noticeably more confident actor compared to his work in Conan the Barbarian. Critics noted improvements in his screen presence, comedic timing, and his ability to communicate through subtle facial expression rather than relying purely on physicality. Some reviewers felt the script gave Conan fewer emotionally challenging moments, but most agreed Schwarzenegger had grown significantly as a leading man, and many audiences appreciated seeing a more approachable version of Conan. In the original film, the character often came across as distant, stoic, and emotionally guarded. The sequel let Schwarzenegger show occasional humor, warmth, and compassion without abandoning the warrior's intimidating side. This slightly softer interpretation proved popular with younger viewers and with families discovering the character for the first time. Grace Jones emerged as one of the film's most widely praised performers. Critics frequently singled out her portrayal of Zula as energetic, fearless, and unforgettably her commanding physical presence set her apart immediately from the traditional female characters found in fantasy films of the era. Rather than existing merely as a romantic interest or a passive companion, Zula fought alongside Conan as an equal. Jones's unconventional style, athleticism, and undeniable charisma earned admiration even from reviewers who otherwise criticized the movie, and over time Zula has become one of the film's most beloved characters. Mako's return as a hero also drew favorable responses. His calm wisdom, gentle humor, and understated performance provided continuity between the two Conan films while balancing out the more extravagant personalities around him. Tracy Walter's Malak generated more divided reactions as some audiences enjoyed the comic relief he brought to the adventure, while others felt the increased emphasis on humor contributed to the lighter tone that set the sequel apart from its predecessor. Sarah Douglas was generally praised for bringing elegance and quiet menace to Queen Taramis. Her screen time was limited, but reviewers acknowledged that she created a memorable antagonist through a controlled performance rather than an exaggerated one. Will Chamberlain, similarly, drew attention simply because of his extraordinary physical presence. The legacy of Conan the Destroyer is both fascinating and a little unconventional. Unlike films that achieve instant recognition as classics, this movie gradually earned its place in fantasy cinema through decades of continued appreciation rather than overwhelming critical acclaim. It never matched the cultural impact of Conan the Barbarian, but the sequel helped keep Conan's popularity alive as one of the greatest fantasy heroes ever created. Its influence can be traced through later fantasy films, television series, comic books, video games, tabletop role-playing games, and even the broader arc of Schwarzenegger's career. More than 40 years after its release, Conan the Destroyer remains an important chapter in the history of cinematic fantasy and continues to attract new audiences who appreciate its handcrafted approach to adventure filmmaking. Perhaps the film's greatest legacy lies in keeping the Conan franchise alive during a crucial period. After Conan the Barbarian's success in 1982, there was no guarantee the character would become a lasting cinematic icon. Sequels often determine whether a franchise grows into something bigger or fades after a single hit. Conan the Destroyer proved that audiences still wanted to spend time in Robert E. Howard's mythical Hyborian Age. Reactions were mixed, but the movie was commercially successful enough to show that Conan had lasting appeal beyond a single film. The sequel also broadened Conan's cinematic identity. The first movie established him as a grim, revenge-driven warrior, while Conan the Destroyer showed another side of the character. Our audiences saw him working within a team, protecting innocent people, showing compassion, and occasionally revealing subtle humor. This broader take influenced later comic books, novels, animated adaptations, and video games, many of which portrayed Conan as more than just a relentless fighter, reinforcing the idea that heroic strength could coexist with loyalty, wisdom, and personal growth. For Schwarzenegger, the movie occupies a unique spot in his career. Conan the Destroyer came out during one of the most important years of his professional life. Just months later, The Terminator turned him into one of Hollywood's biggest stars, launching a career that would define action cinema for decades. Looking back, Conan the Destroyer represents the final stage of Schwarzenegger's transition from bodybuilding champion to global movie icon. Everything he learned playing Conan, physical storytelling, commanding screen presence, fight choreography, and heroic characterization, fed directly into the confidence he brought to later classics like Predator, Total Recall, Commando, and True Lies. Although Conan eventually became associated primarily with Schwarzenegger, the sequel also helped solidify the careers of several supporting performers. Grace Jones's portrayal of Zula remains one of the most celebrated female warrior performances of the 1980s. The character became an enduring favorite among fantasy fans because she challenged traditional expectations of female roles in action films. Rather than existing solely as a romantic interest, Zula fought beside Conan as an equal, inspiring many later fantasy heroines who combined physical strength with independence and unwavering courage. Jones's influence reached beyond fantasy cinema to her striking appearance, distinctive fashion sense, and fearless performance encouraged filmmakers to embrace more unconventional female characters throughout the decade, and later action films increasingly featured women who actively took part in battles rather than remaining passive observers. Conan the Destroyer certainly wasn't the only film driving that shift, but Zula became one of its most memorable examples. The movie also showed how fantasy adventures could successfully incorporate performers from very different backgrounds. Will Chamberlain's turn as Bombata, Andre Tilda copyrights the Giant's portrayal of Dagoth, and Schwarzenegger's own bodybuilding roots all proved that athletes could bring genuine screen presence to mythological storytelling. This casting approach continued throughout the 1980s and 90s, as filmmakers increasingly recruited wrestlers, martial artists, bodybuilders, and professional athletes for physically demanding action roles. Within the fantasy genre itself, Conan the Destroyer helped establish several storytelling conventions that audiences would see repeated in later productions. The idea of assembling a small group of heroes with complementary skills became a familiar narrative structure. The brave warrior, the wise magician, the comic thief, the noble princess, the fierce female fighter, and the hidden traitor would go on to appear in countless fantasy films, television series, novels, and role-playing adventures. Many of these archetypes already existed in literature, but Conan the Destroyer presented them in an accessible cinematic format that shaped visual storytelling for years afterward. The film's practical effects also left an important legacy. Before digital technology transformed visual effects, productions relied on sculptors, makeup artists, puppeteers, mechanical engineers, and miniature builders to bring fantasy worlds to life. Conan the Destroyer stands as one of the better examples of that practical craftsmanship. The Crystal Castle Guardian, the elaborate temple sets, the detailed costumes, the prosthetic makeup, and the Dagoth monster all show how imagination and physical artistry could create mythical creatures without computer-generated imagery. Modern filmmakers and visual effects artists frequently express admiration for practical fantasy productions from the 1980s. As audiences have grown increasingly used to digital spectacle, many have rediscovered an appreciation for movies where creatures physically existed on set, actors interacted with real environments, and props carried genuine weight and texture. Conan the Destroyer benefits enormously from this renewed interest, since its handcrafted visuals now feel charmingly authentic rather than technologically dated. The film also kept Robert E. Howard's original literary creation visibly. Every successful adaptation encourages new audiences to explore the source material, and Conan the Destroyer contributed to renewed interest in Howard's stories throughout the 1980s. One of the most fascinating aspects of Conan the Destroyer is how differently audiences have interpreted the film across the decades. Critical reviews published at the time of its release focused heavily on comparing it to Conan the Barbarian, often judging it for being lighter, less violent, and more accessible. General audiences, though, experienced the movie in a far more personal way. For many viewers, especially those who discovered it on home video or television rather than in theaters, Conan the Destroyer became a defining fantasy adventure of their childhood. Their emotional connection wasn't shaped by critical expectations, but by memorable characters, imaginative creatures, exciting action, and a sense of wonder that made the film easy to revisit again and again. As a result, the movie's reputation has gradually improved over time, showing how audience interpretation can evolve independently of professional criticism. For viewers who watched the film during its original 1984 theatrical run, expectations played a big role in shaping their reactions. Conan the Barbarian had introduced a darker, more philosophical version of Howard's world, and many fans expected the sequel to keep exploring themes of revenge, destiny, and survival with the same serious tone. Instead, they got a colorful fantasy quest filled with comic relief, magical monsters, and a larger supporting cast. Some longtime fans initially saw this shift as a disappointment, feeling the sequel had traded emotional depth for broader entertainment. But another segment of the audience welcomed exactly those changes. The families who found the first film too intense had a much easier time enjoying Conan the Destroyer together. The reduced violence, increased humor, and emphasis on teamwork made the story more accessible to younger viewers while still keeping its adventurous spirit intact. Many children too young to watch Conan the Barbarian safely experienced Conan the Destroyer as their first introduction to the legendary warrior. For that younger generation, the film represented pure fantasy escapism. Children were captivated by enormous castles, magical crystals, mysterious temples, giant monsters, sword fights, and unforgettable heroes. Rather than picking apart narrative structure or tonal consistency, they simply remembered the excitement of watching Conan battle impossible creatures across an ancient mythical world. Those childhood memories stuck with people decades later. Many adults who grew up in the 1980s still speak fondly of the film because it reminds them of weekend movie nights, family television broadcasts, and trips to the neighborhood video rental store. Schwarzenegger's portrayal of Conan resonated differently depending on the viewer's generation. Older audiences often compared his performance directly to the more stoic warrior of the original film. Younger audiences appreciated seeing a hero who combined incredible strength with moments of kindness, humor, and compassion. Conan remained intimidating when he needed to be, but he also smiled occasionally, protected vulnerable companions, and showed genuine emotional growth. This more approachable version of the character let younger viewers admire him not just as an unstoppable fighter, but as someone whose actions reflected courage and honor. Zula, played by Grace Jones, consistently drew positive audience reactions. At a time when female warriors were still relatively rare in mainstream fantasy film, many viewers found her unforgettable. Women and girls in particular often saw Zulu as a refreshing alternative to traditional fantasy heroines, as she didn't wait to be rescued, and she didn't depend on Conan for protection. Instead, she fought alongside him as an equal, showing confidence, physical power, and unwavering loyalty. Jones's unique appearance also shaped how audiences responded to her. Many viewers considered her one of the most striking figures in the entire movie because she challenged conventional ideas of beauty and femininity, and her fearless performance encouraged audiences to embrace characters who stood apart from typical Hollywood stereotypes. Over the years, Zulu has become one of the film's most celebrated characters precisely because she represented something unusual for early 1980s fantasy cinema. Children frequently identified with Princess Jenna, whose journey mirrors the experience of growing up and facing unfamiliar responsibilities. She begins the story protected, inexperienced, and uncertain about the dangerous world around her. And as the adventure unfolds, she gradually develops confidence and resilience despite the overwhelming threats she encounters. Younger viewers often read her growth as proof that courage isn't determined by physical strength alone. Even someone frightened or inexperienced can become brave when circumstances demand it. Malak generated equally divided audience reactions. Some viewers loved his comedic personality because it offered relief from the more serious moments. His cowardice, greed, and awkward humor made him relatable in a world otherwise populated by fearless warriors and powerful sorcerers. Others found him less appealing because they preferred the darker atmosphere of the first film. Even so, Malak became one of the movie's most recognizable supporting characters, particularly among younger audiences who appreciated his lighter approach to adventure. One of the most enduring audience interpretations concerns the theme of friendship. Although Conan remains the central hero, the sequel repeatedly shows that even legendary warriors can't succeed entirely alone. Many viewers appreciated the growing relationships between Conan, Zula, Akiro, Jenna, and even Malaka. The group gradually evolves into something resembling a family, united not by blood but by shared experience and mutual trust. Audiences often found this emotional connection more meaningful than the individual action scenes, because it reflected the importance of loyalty and cooperation in overcoming adversity. Character development in Conan the Destroyer is often overlooked, since the film is remembered mainly for its action, fantasy creatures, and epic quest. But beneath the sword fights and magical adventures lies a story built around personal growth, moral choices, and evolving relationships. Unlike Conan the Barbarian, where the central character is driven almost entirely by revenge, the sequel presents Conan as a more mature hero whose journey is less about defeating enemies and more about learning to put the needs of others above his own desires. Some supporting characters undergo only subtle transformations, but each member of the traveling party contributes to the emotional progression of the narrative, making trust, loyalty, and sacrifice just as important as physical strength. Conan begins the film as a man still carrying the emotional scars of Valeria's death. He's become a legendary warrior whose name is feared across kingdoms, but internally he remains haunted by grief. His victories haven't brought him peace, and despite his reputation he continues wandering the world without a true purpose. This emotional emptiness forms the foundation of his character arc. When Queen Taramis offers the possibility of resurrecting Valeria, Conan immediately accepts her quest, believing it represents his final chance to reclaim the life he lost. This motivation makes him surprisingly vulnerable. Physically he appears almost unstoppable, but emotionally he lets himself be manipulated by hope. Queen Taramis understands this weakness and exploits it perfectly. Conan's willingness to trust her promise shows that even the strongest heroes can become vulnerable when confronted with unresolved grief, and that emotional flaw gives the audience a chance to see a more human side of the legendary barbarian. As the journey progresses, Conan slowly begins to change without fully realizing it. At first, Princess Jenna is simply a means to an end. He protects her because doing so is necessary to fulfill his bargain with the Queen. But as they travel together, his attitude gradually shifts. He starts treating her less as an objective and more as a person, recognizing her innocence, courage, and growing maturity, developing a protective instinct that goes beyond his original mission. This transformation happens gradually rather than through dramatic speeches, which makes it feel natural and believable. The defining moment of Conan's arc arrives when Queen Taramis reveals her deception. Bringing Valeria back requires sacrificing Jenna's life. At this point Conan faces the greatest moral test of the entire story. Everything he's endured throughout the quest has been driven by the hope of seeing Valeria again, and choosing to save Jenna means permanently giving up that dream. His decision shows just how much he's grown. Earlier in his life Conan often acted out of personal survival or revenge. By the end of Conan the Destroyer, he chooses selflessness over personal happiness, accepting that some losses can't be undone and that true honor comes from protecting the living rather than desperately clinging to the past. This emotional maturity transforms him from a powerful warrior into a genuine hero. Princess Jenna undergoes one of the clearest developmental arcs in the film. At the start she's sheltered, inexperienced, and largely unaware of the dangerous world around her. Raised within royal privilege, she initially depends on others for protection and guidance as she's curious and kind, but she lacks confidence and practical experience. Throughout the journey Jenna witnesses betrayal, violence, sacrifice, and courage, and she gradually learns that leadership involves difficult decisions rather than simply occupying a royal position. Instead of remaining frightened by every danger, she begins showing determination and resilience. By the end of the film, she's developed into someone capable of taking responsibility for her future kingdom, and her experiences prepare her emotionally for leadership in ways palace life never could. Zulu experiences a quieter but equally meaningful journey. When Conan first encounters her, she's been condemned to death. After he saves her, she chooses to follow him out of gratitude. But her loyalty soon becomes something much deeper. Unlike many supporting characters in fantasy adventures, Zula never serves merely as an assistant. She consistently proves herself through courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to the group. What makes her development particularly interesting is that it happens mainly through action rather than dialogue. She rarely talks about her feelings, yet every decision she makes shows increasing trust in Conan and genuine concern for the rest of the group. Her relationship with Conan is built on mutual respect rather than romance. They recognize each other's abilities, fight side by side, and rely on one another without needing lengthy emotional conversations. This understated dynamic remains one of the film's strongest examples of character chemistry. Akiro the Wizard functions as the emotional anchor of the group. Having already accompanied Conan on previous adventures, he understands the warrior better than anyone else. Unlike the younger characters, Akiro doesn't undergo a dramatic personal transformation. Instead he serves as a source of stability, wisdom, and guidance, resembling a mentor who quietly encourages others to make the right decisions without forcing his opinions on them. Akiro's calm presence helps balance Conan's emotional struggles. Whenever Conan becomes overwhelmed by anger or frustration, Akiro offers perspective. His experience lets him recognize dangers beyond physical combat, particularly those involving magic, prophecy, and human ambition, and while his own personality stays fairly constant, his influence meaningfully shapes the growth of those around him. Malak initially appears to be little more than comic relief, greedy, cowardly, opportunistic, and seemingly interested only in his own survival. At first glance he seems completely unsuited to heroic adventure. But as the story progresses, subtle changes start to emerge. Despite his fear, Malak repeatedly chooses to stay with the group even when escape would be easier, and his loyalty develops gradually, almost reluctantly. One of the greatest artistic achievements of Conan the Destroyer is its costume and set design. Long before fantasy films could rely on sophisticated computer-generated imagery, productions depended on physical craftsmanship to convince audiences that imaginary worlds truly existed. Every costume, piece of armor, weapon, palace, temple, and creature had to be carefully designed and built by hand. The production team created an ancient civilization that felt both mythical and believable, blending influences from numerous historical cultures while maintaining its own unique visual identity. Even decades after its release, the film remains an impressive example of practical production design, showing how carefully crafted physical environments can immerse audiences in a fantasy world. The Hyborian Age portrayed in Conan the Destroyer has no direct historical equivalent. Instead, the designers borrowed architectural and artistic elements from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, Persia, medieval Europe, and various Asian civilizations. Rather than copying any single culture, they combined recognizable historical influences into an entirely fictional world, letting audiences feel the kingdom carried thousands of years of forgotten history without needing strict historical accuracy. Perhaps the most recognizable costume in the entire film belongs to Conan himself. Schwarzenegger's wardrobe immediately tells audiences everything they need to know about the character. Unlike kings or noblemen who surround themselves with expensive fabrics and elaborate jewelry, Conan dresses for survival. His clothing consists mainly of leather armor, animal fur, heavy boots, belts, metal wrist guards, and practical accessories built for combat rather than appearance. Every element of his costume reflects his personality. The weathered leather suggests years of constant travel through dangerous environments. The fur emphasizes his origins as a barbarian from harsh northern regions, and his broad belt, sword harness, and simple equipment show that he values usefulness above luxury. Nothing about his appearance feels decorative for its own sake. Even after becoming famous throughout the kingdoms, Conan keeps dressing like a warrior who expects every day to bring another life or death battle. The costume designers wisely avoided making Conan look overly polished. His clothing bears visible signs of wear, reinforcing the impression of a man who's spent years surviving in unforgiving landscapes. Dirt, scratches, faded leather, and worn materials all add to the authenticity of his appearance. These details keep him from looking like someone wearing a costume, making him instead seem like he genuinely lives within this ancient world. Conan's sword deserves special attention as both a prop and an extension of his costume. More than just a weapon, it functions as a visual symbol of his identity. Its considerable size reflects Conan's extraordinary strength, while its simple yet powerful design avoids unnecessary decoration. Unlike ceremonial weapons carried by royalty, Conan's sword looks practical, heavy, and capable of enduring countless battles. It remains constantly within reach throughout the film, emphasizing that combat has become an inseparable part of his life. Grace Jones's costume as Zulu is one of the most memorable visual designs of the entire production. The designers created an outfit balancing functionality with striking individuality. Rather than putting her in elaborate gowns or revealing fantasy clothing that would have restricted movement, they equipped her with practical leather armor, allowing complete freedom during combat sequences. The armor enhances Jones's naturally athletic physique without compromising the character's credibility as a warrior. Her costume includes leather straps, protective arm guards, durable boots, and simple accessories suggesting years of survival under difficult conditions. The design reinforces Zula's independence while visually setting her apart from every other character, and combined with Jones's distinctive hairstyle and commanding physical presence, The costume turns Zula into one of fantasy cinema's most iconic female warriors. Princess Jenna's wardrobe reflects an entirely different social background. At the start of the story, she wears elegant royal garments made from rich fabrics decorated with jewelry and intricate embroidery. These costumes emphasize her sheltered upbringing and noble status. Soft colors, flowing materials, and delicate accessories communicate innocence rather than strength. As the journey progresses, Jenna's appearance subtly evolves. She never abandons her royal identity, but her clothing gradually becomes more practical as she encounters dangerous environments beyond the palace walls. The changes aren't dramatic, but they effectively mirror her emotional growth as she begins the story looking like someone protected from hardship and finishes looking far more capable of facing the responsibilities awaiting her. Queen Taramise's costumes communicate authority through luxury. Her robes feature elaborate patterns, rich colors, flowing fabrics, metallic decoration, and impressive jewelry that immediately establish her status as ruler. Every outfit appears carefully planned to project absolute confidence and control. Her crowns, necklaces, bracelets, and embroidered garments reinforce her political power while also suggesting magical sophistication. Interestingly, her costumes stay immaculate throughout the film. Unlike Conan or the traveling companions, she rarely shows any physical signs of hardship, and this visual contrast emphasizes her separation from the dangerous realities faced by those carrying out her plans as she commands from comfort while others suffer on her behalf, reinforcing the moral divide between ruler and hero. A hero's clothing reflects wisdom accumulated through experience rather than wealth or military power. His layered robes, weathered fabric, staff, and modest accessories communicate knowledge instead of physical strength. The costume designers intentionally avoided making him look glamorous, so instead, every wrinkle and faded piece of material suggests decades spent studying ancient mysteries rather than pursuing material possessions. The screenplay of Conan the Destroyer occupies an interesting place within fantasy cinema because it deliberately adopts a different storytelling style from its predecessor. While Conan the Barbarian relied on sparse dialogue, philosophical narration, and long stretches of visual storytelling, the sequel embraces a more traditional adventure structure built around a larger ensemble, lighter conversation, comic relief, and clearer exposition. Written by Stanley Mann, with the story developed from characters originally created by Robert E. Howard, the script balances mythology, action, humor, and character interaction in a way that makes the film more accessible to broad audiences. Some critics argue the screenplay lacks the depth of the original, but many viewers appreciated its straightforward narrative and memorable character exchanges. Over the years, the script has been reassessed as an entertaining example of classic 1980s fantasy writing rather than a direct continuation of the darker tone set by the first film. One of the screenplay's greatest strengths is its simplicity. Rather than overwhelming audiences with complicated political conflicts or elaborate mythology, the story presents a clear objective almost immediately. Conan is offered an apparently impossible bargain to escort Princess Jenna on a dangerous quest, and Queen Taramise will restore Valeria to life. This premise instantly establishes both the emotional motivation and the central narrative direction. Viewers understand exactly why Conan accepts the mission, and the script wastes very little time before sending the characters out into the wider world. This clear structure reflects the screenplay's roots in traditional adventure literature. Like many classic heroic tales, the narrative follows a straightforward progression. The heroes receive a mission, assemble a group of companions, overcome increasingly dangerous obstacles, discover hidden betrayal, confront ultimate evil, and finally return home having grown from their experiences. Modern audiences sometimes expect intricate plot twists and morally ambiguous storytelling, but Conan the Destroyer embraces the timeless appeal of the mythic to its simplicity, lets the audience focus on character relationships and imaginative world-building rather than constantly untangling complicated plot mechanics. Dialogue plays a far bigger role in this sequel than it did in Conan the Barbarian. Schwarzenegger's Conan speaks more often, reflecting both the actor's growing confidence and the screenplay's lighter tone. Rather than staying almost entirely silent, Conan now engages more openly with his companions, offering observations, occasional humor, and expressions of concern. These conversations humanize the character without fundamentally changing his personality. He remains direct, practical, and economical with words, but audiences gain a better sense of his emotional state through what he chooses to say. One of the screenplay's most effective qualities is that Conan's dialogue always reflects his background. He never speaks like a scholar or a politician. His language stays simple, honest, and rooted in action rather than theory. When he talks about loyalty, honor, or danger, his words carry weight precisely because they come from experience rather than philosophy. The writers wisely avoided giving Conan overly elaborate speeches that would have clashed with the character established in the previous film. Queen Taramise's dialogue offers an interesting contrast. Every line she speaks is carefully measured, polite, and composed, and on the surface she appears generous and reasonable. Yet subtle choices in wording hint at her manipulative nature rather than openly threatening those around her, as she uses promises, half-truths, and carefully controlled information to influence people's decisions. The screenplay gradually reveals her deception not through a dramatic confession, but through increasingly suspicious conversations that lead audiences to question her motives long before the final revelation. Princess Jenna's dialogue evolves alongside her character development throughout the story. Early conversations emphasize innocence, curiosity, and uncertainty as she asks questions, seeks reassurance, and relies heavily on those protecting her. As the journey continues, though, her speech becomes noticeably more confident. She begins expressing independent opinions and questioning decisions instead of simply accepting instructions. The changes are subtle but effective, letting the audience recognize her emotional growth without needing dramatic declarations. Perhaps the screenplay's most distinctive voice belongs to Malak, the film's primary source of comic relief. His conversations are full of nervous observations, exaggerated complaints, selfish calculations, and humorous misunderstandings. Malak often says exactly what many ordinary people might think when confronted with terrifying monsters or impossible dangers, and his fear creates comedy precisely because it contrasts so sharply with Conan's fearless determination. Importantly, the humor rarely feels disconnected from the story. Instead, it offers moments of relief that keep the adventure from becoming emotionally exhausting. Grace Jones's Zula demonstrates another interesting aspect of the screenplay. Unlike Malak, she communicates far more through action than through lengthy conversation. Her dialogue stays concise, confident, and purposeful as she rarely wastes words, preferring to let her decisions define her character. This restraint proves highly effective, because every sentence she speaks reinforces her image as a capable warrior who values loyalty over unnecessary conversation. The marketing campaign for Conan the Destroyer reflected both the changing direction of the franchise and the rapid rise of Arnold Schwarzenegger as one of Hollywood's most recognizable new stars. Released in 1984, the film arrived during a period when fantasy adventure was becoming increasingly popular with mainstream audiences. The original Conan the Barbarian had successfully introduced the legendary Cimmerian warrior to moviegoers, but Universal Pictures wanted the sequel to reach an even broader audience. As a result, the promotional campaign emphasized epic adventure, spectacular fantasy, memorable creatures, and exciting action rather than the darker, more violent themes that had defined the first film. Every aspect of the marketing, from posters and trailers to merchandise and home video releases, reflected this shift toward accessible entertainment. while still presenting Conan as one of cinema's greatest heroic icons. Perhaps the most important element of the campaign was Schwarzenegger himself. By the time Conan the Destroyer entered production, he was no longer just a former bodybuilding champion trying to establish himself as an actor. Conan the Barbarian had already proven audiences accepted him as a leading man, and anticipation for his upcoming science fiction film, The Terminator, was beginning to build. Universal recognized that Schwarzenegger had become the franchise's greatest selling point, and placed him at the center of nearly every promotional image. The theatrical posters immediately communicated this strategy. Conan stood prominently in the foreground, sword in hand, surrounded by the supporting cast and mythical creatures. His muscular physique, determined expression, and unmistakable silhouette dominated the artwork, leaving no doubt about who the story revolved around. Rather than focusing on plot details, the poster sold a promise of heroic adventure. Audiences didn't need to understand the narrative before buying a ticket. Seeing Schwarzenegger standing against a backdrop of monsters, castles, and warriors was often enough to generate excitement. The artwork itself reflected the tradition of hand-painted movie posters that defined much of the 1970s and 80s. Before digital design became standard, talented illustrators created dramatic compositions filled with exaggerated lighting, vivid colors, and carefully arranged characters. Conan the Destroyer's posters became particularly memorable because they presented the movie almost like a fantasy painting, capturing the epic scope of the adventure while highlighting its mythical atmosphere. Today those original posters remain highly collectible among fans of fantasy cinema and movie memorabilia. The theatrical trailers followed a similar approach. Rather than revealing major plot twists, they focused on showcasing the film's spectacular visuals. Audiences got glimpses of enormous temples, mysterious castles, dangerous monsters, magical artifacts, sword fights, horseback chases, and breathtaking landscapes. Fast-paced editing emphasized excitement while avoiding excessive explanation. The trailers suggested viewers would experience a grand fantasy journey filled with danger and wonder, without giving away the central betrayal involving Queen Taramis or the true purpose of Princess Jenna's quest. Schwarzenegger featured prominently throughout these previews, and nearly every trailer highlighted his combat scenes, impressive physique, and commanding presence. His image had already become synonymous with physical strength, making him the perfect symbol for an epic fantasy adventure. Even viewers unfamiliar with Robert E. Howard's literary character could immediately recognize Conan as an unstoppable hero capable of overcoming impossible odds. Another significant part of the marketing campaign involved emphasizing the film's ensemble cast. Grace Jones appeared prominently in promotional materials thanks to her growing international fame as a singer, fashion icon, and performer. Her striking appearance set her apart immediately from conventional Hollywood actresses, drawing attention from audiences interested not just in fantasy film but in contemporary music and popular culture. Posters and advertisements frequently featured images of Zulu alongside Conan, highlighting the film's unusual partnership between two powerful warriors. Wilt Chamberlain's involvement also generated promotional interest. Already regarded as one of the greatest basketball players in history, Chamberlain brought a different audience to the film, and publicity often emphasized his extraordinary height and physical presence, stirring up curiosity about his confrontation with Schwarzenegger. Likewise, Andre Tilde copyrights The Giant's participation attracted wrestling fans, even though many audiences didn't immediately realize he was the one playing the monstrous Tigath beneath the elaborate makeup and prosthetics. Television advertising played an increasingly important role in the early 1980s, and Conan the Destroyer benefited from extensive commercial promotion. Short television spots focused on visually striking moments that could grab viewers' attention within seconds. Explosions, sword fights, magical creatures, and dramatic musical cues dominated these advertisements, while voice-over narration promised audiences an unforgettable adventure. These commercials frequently aired during family programming and sporting events, reflecting Universal's intention to broaden the film's appeal beyond the adult audience that had primarily supported the original movie. Magazine promotion formed another essential piece of the campaign. Entertainment publications featured interviews with Schwarzenegger discussing his physical preparation, sword training, and return to the role of Conan. Fitness magazines embraced the movie enthusiastically too, since Schwarzenegger remained one of the world's most famous bodybuilders. So articles often combined discussion of the film with features examining his exercise routines, nutrition, and transition into major Hollywood productions. This crossover exposure significantly expanded awareness of the movie beyond traditional film journalism. Conan the Destroyer occupies a unique position within fantasy cinema, existing both as a sequel to Conan the Barbarian and as part of the broader tradition of sword-and-sorcery adventure that flourished in the late 1970s and 1980s. Comparing the film with its predecessor, with other fantasy epics of its era, and with later Conan adaptations reveals just how differently filmmakers have interpreted Robert E. Howard's legendary warrior over the decades. The sequel often lives in the shadow of the original, but it built its own identity by emphasizing adventure, teamwork, and mythical spectacle instead of the darker themes that define the first film. Understanding these differences helps explain why Conan the Destroyer continues to inspire both admiration and debate among fantasy fans. The most obvious comparison is with Conan the Barbarian, released just 2 years earlier. Both films star Schwarzenegger and are based on Robert E. Howard's famous character, but they differ dramatically in tone, pacing, and storytelling philosophy. Conan the Barbarian is essentially a revenge story, following Conan from childhood trauma through slavery, personal loss, and eventual vengeance against Thulsa Doom. It's a story filled with philosophical reflection on destiny, civilization, and the nature of power, with long stretches passing with very little dialogue, letting visual storytelling and Basil Poldrese's powerful score carry much of the emotional weight. Conan the Destroyer approaches its material from an entirely different angle. Instead of revenge, it presents a classic heroic quest. Conan already has legendary status when the story begins, and rather than seeking justice for past suffering, he accepts a mission driven by hope rather than anger. The sequel embraces magical artifacts, enchanted temples, mythical creatures, and a larger ensemble cast, making it feel closer to traditional fairy tale and adventure serial than historical epic. The visual styles of the two films also differ considerably. Conan the Barbarian emphasizes earthy colors, harsh landscapes, realistic violence, and natural lighting. Every environment looks weathered and unforgiving, reinforcing the brutality of Conan's world. Conan the Destroyer, by contrast, adopts brighter colors, more elaborate architecture, fantastical creatures, and visually spectacular locations. Crystal castles, magical temples, royal palaces, and mystical rituals create a world that feels more openly mythical than historically grounded. Characterization marks another important distinction. In the first film, Conan spends much of the story alone or with only a few companions, and his emotional journey stays intensely personal, shaped by grief and revenge. The sequel turns him into the leader of a diverse fellowship. Hero, Zula, Malak, Jenna, and Bombata each contribute their own strengths, shifting the focus from individual determination toward cooperation and teamwork. This structural difference significantly changes the emotional experience of both films. Another interesting comparison can be made with Red Sonja, released the following year in 1985. Schwarzenegger appears in that film as Lord Kalidor rather than Conan, due to licensing issues, but audiences immediately notice the similarities. Both movies feature ancient kingdoms, magical villains, elaborate sword fights, and physically imposing heroes traveling through fantasy landscapes. Red Sonja, though, places greater emphasis on its female protagonist while leaning even harder into traditional fantasy elements than Conan the Destroyer. Many viewers regard Conan the Destroyer as the stronger production, thanks to its larger budget, more polished visual effects, and stronger supporting cast. The film can also be compared with Gruel, released in 1983. Like Conan the Destroyer, Gruel combines fantasy, mythology, monsters, magical weapons, and heroic quests. However, Gruel leans heavily toward fairy tale romance and science fantasy, blending castles with alien invasions and supernatural powers. Conan the Destroyer stays more firmly rooted in the sword and sorcery tradition inspired directly by Robert E. Howard's writing.